Hero, in today's show, I'm going to answer, I hope definitively, a question that I get, I'll say with surprising frequency, and that is Jewish a race? What kind of people is the Jewish people? Is it genetic? Is it religious? Can it be both? Can it be neither? And this is a question I get all the time from Jew-curious people and just people who make assumptions out there in the world. And I think it's important at a time of, we'll say, rising public expressions of anti-Semitism that we address those who would divide us to consolidate their own power and weaken the powers of others. So let's get into it right after this bass. Wanted to jump right into it there. Everybody in the live studio audience who are used to this being a live recording of a podcast. So just glad everybody's here. This is a topic I wanted to address. This is a question I get with fair frequency, or sometimes people don't ask the question. They just make assumptions. And those assumptions can sometimes be good. Those assumptions can sometimes do what assumptions do and make, they say, when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. So this is that's a zoological term, so I could say that on the internet. But I'm going to take a little silence print here for the sake of recording. Okay, and that might be kind of a weird start if you're just joining us for the first time here on my YouTube channel. What we're doing right now is a live studio recording for the Jew Curious Show podcast, and God willing, this gets recorded and out on iTunes sometime soon. But I also say some radio voice soundy things. If you're not accustomed to this, just stick around. I am going to answer the question as best I can and answer other people's questions who have shown up for the live chat. That's what I love to do most, is have conversations with real Jew-curious people just like you. Today's question, once again, is Jewish a race? And we'll get back to that in just a second. First, I want to thank our announcers who I'm splicing in later. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Joey, for those inspiring opening beats. Thank you to the live studio audience who has joined us today with your questions. And most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious Show. Today's topic is Jewish a race? And I'm going to answer that in about one word with several other words attached to that. And I want to make sure we get to questions from people in the live studio audience as well. First, I just want to acknowledge the people who've shown up to join us today. Trig, nice to see you. Kathy from Southern California. We got some regulars who I recognize here. Hey, Ruthie, welcome also from Southern California. We got a Southern California party going on with Carla is here from SoCal here in the area. And now we're bi-coastal with Miriam from New Hampshire. Erica, nice to see you as well. Courtney Smith, very nice to see you here with us. Andrew from Tennessee and Vanessa from Germany. We are bi-coastal and international. So, I'm very delighted to learn with everybody today. This can be kind of a controversial subject. I'm expecting to get a lot of comments on this video sometime later when people are looking this issue up on YouTube and other search engines. People talk a lot about the Jewish race, how we are different ethnicities set apart. So let me just answer this question right off the bat. Is Jewish a race? Definitively, no. And there is, how do I want to say this? People often ask, are the Jews a people or are they a religion? Are they an ethnic group or are they a faith? And my best answer that I've ever gotten to this question from somebody else that I've asked, one of the wisest teachers I know, also a good friend of mine, Rabbi Adam Greenwald, says, I prefer to think of us as a family, right? A big extended family. Think about your family. There's a lot of people in your family that you are related to. There's a lot of people in your family who you are not related to, right? They came in through marriage or adoption or some other way, but they are a part of your family just as sure as are your blood relatives, right? And you can be born into a family without trying too hard, right? Almost no work on your part except for that whole birth business. It's mostly your parents working at that. And other people helping them. So you can be born into a family and just inherit that identity automatically. You can join a family legally, often through marriage, through adoption, through other means, just being kind of a Ben bite or a bot bite, somebody who's just thought of as part of the family. There's sometimes legal paperwork involved, sometimes ceremonies involved. You can leave a family. You can leave a family through divorce or just not staying in touch. And this also describes how the Jewish people cohere together. There are people who are born Jewish. There are people who become Jewish through legal processes and ceremonies. There are people who turn their backs on Judaism as well. And so not every Jewish person in the world is related to every other Jewish person, but that doesn't mean that everybody in this family isn't part of this family. And I want to address specifically the idea that Judaism or Jewishness is, by definition, an ethnicity or what they call a race. Now, the whole word race is complicated, and there are scholars on this more advanced than I am in their research, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure you will, especially since I've advertised this video on Twitter, so we'll see what happens there. But my understanding is that by and large, the whole notion of race as a subdivision of the species Homo sapiens, humanity, is largely an invention of the 19th century, right? When Darwin came along and started showing that different species came from other species, and they subdivided until they were so far apart that they became unique groups. And Darwin was looking at birds in the Galapagos and places like that. And this was a time of quote-unquote enlightenment, a time of the rise of the scientific method. I mean, it began before that, but really came into its own in the 19th century with industrialism and secularism and things like that. There were those who looked at the budding science of taxonomy and said, man, I wonder if we could divide people like this. Right? People whose ancestors come more recently from Africa. I mean, I think, if I'm not mistaken, everybody's ancestors come from Africa eventually, but people who came more recently from Africa look a certain way, and people who come from Asia look a certain way, and people who come from Europe look a certain way, and we can make some generalizations about that. But what if we started applying some science to it? Maybe gave people culturally biased IQ tests. Maybe we measured cranial capacity and things like that, and we acted like scientists. Maybe we could fabricate some data in a way that said one group of humans is superior to another group of humans in let's say physicality, in intellectual capacity, in even morality. And they said, hey, we can divide people into black, white, Hispanic, Asian, even Jewish, and we could apply this kind of pseudoscience to it and call this the study of different races and define these races. And they were usually defined in such a way that gave one group an advantage over another, or defined one group as superior to another, or gave justification with very weak logic to it to subjugate another people, to cast out another people, to scapegoat another people. And I know this, I didn't start this, this goes back to biblical times, but I am regretting the idea that Jews invented the term scapegoat with that whole thing. It was a couple of parshiot ago in Acharei Mot, where we have the goat that's cast out of the camp after the high priest Aharon would confess all the sins of the people into this goat, then cast the goat out, inventing the term scapegoat. And oftentimes one group will scapegoat another group, projecting its weaknesses onto that group, and punishing that group for errors of its own. And this has happened time and time again, as cultures have clashed, as different groups have jockeyed for power in national settings and local settings and global settings. And so that's where we got the whole idea of race to begin with. Genetically speaking, if we're going to be scientific about it, humans, people talk a lot about this 23andMe stuff, and I can swab my cheek and I could test I'm 50% this and 45% that and 5% that, or 12% this and 10% that, and that tells me something about how I'm different from other people. But if my understanding of the human genome is correct, and I'm only a layperson here, people are 99.9999999, and I can go on all day percent exactly the same genetically, right? What the human genome, how it differentiates us, is based on one tiny little part of the genome, right? We are, I think, something like 99.5% chimpanzee, every human being on Earth. Again, you could test my numbers on this if you like, but the proportions are there. We're something like 98.7% turtle. If I'm not mistaken, our genome is something like 95% banana, right? So if we really want to differentiate each other, we'll find ways, and we'll make up the science to make that sound right. And it's usually done at the behest of one group that wants to assert power over another group, or to lower the other group's esteem in the eyes of, let's say, an electorate or a social class or something like that. And so that's why this idea of race was fabricated. And even if it bore weight at all, which it doesn't, you still couldn't say that the Jewish people, as it is today, and almost how it's been for most of our history, going back roughly 4,000 years, you couldn't say that we were genetically, what's the word? Homogeneous. You couldn't say that we were genetically homogeneous, that we were one consistent subspecies of humanity, distinguishable from other subgroups of humanity. You couldn't do it because from the beginning, in the beginning of the Jewish people, God reaches out to this dude, Avram, and says, look, this is a deal between me and you. I'll be your God, you be my Avram. And he didn't pick Avram based on any kind of genetic characteristics. He actually picked him because of his character, because of the kind of person, how he expressed himself in the world differently from other people in his own family. So you couldn't say that it started with some sort of genetic difference, because it didn't. And then that mantle goes to Avram and his immediate family, just starting with Sarai. They later changed their names to Avraham and Sarah. And yes, part of this covenant was passed down to Avraham's descendants, Yitzhak and Yaakov, and then Yaakov's 12 sons and a daughter that became the 12 tribes, or 11 tribes and 2 half-tribes with Ephraim and Manasseh. Yes, part of that peoplehood, that familyhood, was preserved genetically, but from the very beginning, when Abraham established his household in the world, everybody in that household, under his care, under his responsibility, regardless of what family they were a part of at the time, if they were in Abraham's household, they were part of the covenant, right? So everybody, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, if they work for Abraham and they became associated with this tribe, they became part of the family. And so from the very beginning, there's been variation, right? And then we go down into Egypt. We're still mostly a family at that point, and we're a people apart. We live in a different neighborhood in Egypt. We live in Goshen because that's where the good pasture land is, and we were ranchers, or however you want to put that. And then after a while, we left. And if you want to read about that, I highly suggest going to a Passover Seder and looking at your Haggadah. The book of first 12 chapters or so, the book of Exodus tells that story as well. But what it also tells us is that when we left, we didn't leave alone, even insofar as we were a somewhat genetically homogeneous family unit distinct from other peoples in the area. When we left Egypt, we did not leave alone. It said that an Erev Rav went with us, a mixed multitude, saw what we were up to, saw our mission, saw what was left of Egypt, and came along with us, right? And there's some, I'll say, inferior, ugly midrashim that say things like, well, this Erev Rav just went to tag along and was just a pain in the butt. They just wanted to leave Egypt. They didn't actually stick around for the good parts, right? But that is part of our tendency to separate ourselves, right? Is to separate other people from us. But the fact is, the Erev Rav went with the family, and we all marched to Sinai together, and we all got the Torah together. And so we have been more than a genetic family since the covenant, the renewal of the covenant with God at Mount Sinai. We have been more than just a genetic family. Now, for a while, I'll say we were probably a pretty stable population group, and that's why you can take these 23andMe tests and say, oh, there's something that seems Jewish, because I'm going to admit, through a good part of our history, we have been a pretty insular people. We mostly married within the extended family, with, thank God, enough genetic variation by then that it wasn't a problem. I had a rule against marrying cousins from very early on. But so, yes, we stayed pretty much kept to our own for the better part of, let's say, a couple of thousand years, right? We were distinctive people in Jerusalem, in Judea. Many of our tribes folk got scattered to the winds with the Assyrian domination of the northern kingdom. And still the tribes that were left and persisted after the Roman domination, after the Babylonian exile and the Roman exile into the world, and then we spread out across the globe. And some of our people stayed close by and settled around the Arabian Peninsula and other parts of what we now think of as the Middle East, in Iran and Iraq and other places around there. And these today are what we call Mizrahi Jews, generally of this part of the world. Some of us went sort of straight west and maybe a little bit to the south, around the rim of the Mediterranean into North Africa and southern Europe and settling in the Iberian Peninsula. And we have a group of, sort of a large subgroup of Jews we call Sephardi Jews today, people who can trace some of their family tree over the last 1,000 years or so into that Mediterranean rim. And then a lot of us went sort of north and west and settled in places like Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Western Europe. A lot of the Jews from Europe went in to settle South America and North America, and some went east as far as, over time, into China. There's a settlement of Jews, the Kaifeng Jews of Shanghai, I believe. We've spread throughout the world, just people seeking their opportunity, and some just seeking clusters of family close by. But every place we have gone in the world, we have, to a certain extent, intermarried. And people say, oh, intermarriage is just an aberration on the Jewish people, and it's a blight, and it's diluting, Jewishness. And that's just not historically accurate or factual. Yes, we mostly stuck to marrying other Jews, but all along the way, we have picked up, some local DNA, as it were. Things happen. And that's why people, Jews from the Middle East probably look a little bit different than Jews from some parts of, let's say, Eastern Europe, where, families had been settled for hundreds of years in very cold parts of the world. And so from the beginning, from that first relationship between God and Avram, there has been a variation among our people that couldn't be considered a single race. Yes, there was some, let's say, genetic stability in times where we were shunned in times where we've been kicked out of every country that's ever called itself a country, sometimes 2 or 3 times. And, folks wouldn't intermingle with us and we wouldn't intermingle with folks. And yet there has always been some kind of variation. And this whole idea of calling the Jewish people a race or a people apart is, there was a recent article, I want to say it was in Refinery 29, some publication like that. There's a great link, look for it on Twitter, saying that anti-Semitism is the world's oldest conspiracy theory. And it has come in several guises over the millennia, right? One of our earliest examples is biblical anti-Semitism. And there's this great kind of tripartite model that, again, Rabbi Greenwald came up with that classifies anti-Semitism as biblical anti-Semitism, and then religious anti-Semitism, and then racial anti-Semitism. The earliest is biblical. There was, again, this goes back to the very beginning of the book of Exodus, or Sefer Shemot, where the king says, there's this people in that neighborhood over in Goshen, and they've grown very numerous, and I've grown very concernicus that they might upset my power, right? Pharaoh didn't even say we would upset his power. He said, if I'm at war with somebody else, they might join that other somebody else and fight against me. And so this is a distinct people, and I fear their power. So how about I assert my power by enslaving them? Once again, in the book of Esther, we get this guy named Haman. Boo! If you're in the chat, everybody boo Haman. Haman, because of a personal beef with a particular Jewish person named Mordecai, who wouldn't bow down to him, he said, you know what, king? His boss was the king. You know what, king? There's this people that's different from us, and they don't follow our laws, and we should commit mass genocide. What do you say? Right. And so from very early on in biblical sources, we see that we have been, what are the kids saying now, othered. We have been distinguished and set apart to subjugate, to consolidate somebody else's power. And so what Rabbi Greenwald calls biblical anti-Semitism, to me, just feels simply more monarchical or political anti-Semitism. Then there has been religious anti-Semitism as well, with the rise of Christianity and then the rise of Islam, although I have to say, historically, we got it worse from Christian populations, that we had various libels of deicide, like this myth that somehow Jews were responsible for killing Jesus. God forbid. And this kind of religiously based anti-Semitism was a new thing, but it was all the rage for, I'm going to say, about 1,000 to 2,000 years, mostly in Christian Europe. And then, sometimes under Muslim empires we fared well. That was the golden age of Jewish culture in Muslim Spain, until a different group of Muslims, the Almohades, came in and weren't as friendly to us. But at various times, religions have set themselves against us not on political basis or on racial basis, which hadn't been invented yet, but for religious reasons. Right? We weren't cottoning to their religion, so we were fair game, and our very existence made them feel insecure, and so we were subjugated on that basis. And then, like I said, along with the 19th century and a lot of the science that came out of that also bred pseudoscience that became popular with political figures who said, what if I could consolidate my own power by setting apart this Jewish people, subjugating them, and scapegoating them? And you know what's going to be most successful? If I can make other people in my group think that they aren't just a different family, they are a different kind of human. They are a deficient form of humanity to my form of humanity. And so that began the definition of Jews as a race. And this was used against us in Europe in the 19th century, and as nationalism first emerged and then, sort of took hold, started earlier, but really took hold in the 19th century, consolidated in the 20th century. Germans used this kind of racial theory of Judaism to subjugate us, not only in Germany, but also that had sort of caught on in Russia and in the Soviet Union as well. And there are all sorts of posters with people with a certain Eastern European features and curly hair and big noses and all that BS that characterize Jews as a race. And not for nothing, if you've got people walking around today with 19th century ideals, they continue to bear this myth forward, right? So there is talk today about Jews being a race, about Jews being a different kind of human being, and they would claim a deficient kind of human being, whether physically or morally or what have you. Yes, there's that kind of talk, but take a look at the rest of the ideas that some of these groups hold, right? They like that race card because it's simple to understand and it rebels against modern logic, modern thought, science, but it serves to maintain power among a group that's feeling increasingly insecure. And so that's the long version. The short version is no. Because if we were a distinct race, insofar as such a thing existed, which it doesn't, yes, there are differences between peoples from different parts of the world and people with some very minor genetic variations. And I don't want to rob people of their culture by saying we're all the same and kind of gray wash or blandify this whole business. I like having a distinct culture. I like having a distinct family. It makes me feel secure. It makes me feel a brotherhood with other Jews around the world. So I don't want to erase that. But for someone else to declare that we are a different kind of human being is scientifically untrue, historically a bubamaisa, a myth, and is mostly used to harm us and to help them. And so that's what I wanted to address today. When you see people calling out, increasingly public demonstrations. A couple of years ago, I made the observation that anonymous Twitter handles are the new white hood. On social media, people can hide behind fake identities or null identities, anonymous identities, and have said more and more horrible things that we thought we had exorcised from the public debate over the last 50, 70, 100 years, and it's coming back. The thing is, now the hoods are off. People are publicly identifying with these points of view. Some of them are still hiding behind masks, like the Nazis who protested a Holocaust memorial in Missouri in the last few days. They wouldn't show their faces. They were wearing masks while they were protesting outside of a Holocaust memorial event. They were waving red Nazi flags with swastikas that people in that memorial event had actually fought as soldiers to fight in Europe, and now they get to see it today. But those cowards were wearing masks. Most ironic for me is that they were also holding up a picture of Jesus Christ, one of the sort of blonde, blue-eyed European versions of Jesus Christ. So they were walking around yelling about Jews, holding a picture of a Jew, which just tickles my irony bone. I'll put it that way. But those guys were wearing masks. However, we have people in power, in elected office today, and I'm not going to name one because there's more than one, who would use this distinction against us, who would call us a race in order to separate us from the rest of of Americans or the rest of humanity. And I wanted to give you a little bit of historical background, a little bit of scientific background to say that it is patently untrue. So that's my rant for about the last half hour. I'm sorry I got a bit of a soapbox there, gang. I do appreciate a lot of people booing Haman there in the chat. So I want to take a look and see what questions people have. I'm seeing a few things about. Make sure if you have a question, you put a question mark on it. It makes it easier for me to see in chat. And sorry, this is bad radio, but I'm just pausing to look. I do appreciate Adit from New York saying shalom. Hope everybody's having a great day. I hope so too. I mean, it's hard to talk about tough topics, but I do hope everybody's having a good day. Courtney shares DNA tests can only prove up to 98% because of the roots of everyone starting in Africa. That's true. We're so alike. Even as people can look very different. And I walk around the street, I'll tell you, just confessing personally, I marvel at the variety of the human race. And I do that as a big dude. I'm about 6'2". I'll say I'm on the north side of 250, several miles north of that. So I'm a big dude. And I walk around and I see average sized people and I'm like, wow, that's variety, right? There's small people, there's medium sized people, there's big people. There's people of all colors. I went to a thing at my kid's school yesterday, and just by headgear, I could count 3 or 4 different religious backgrounds going on. People with yarmulkes on, Muslim women covering their hair, a family where where the wife had a bindi on her forehead and the husband had something on his forehead as well, and just the variety of humanity. Right. This is a teaching from Mishnah Sanhedrin. I believe I want to say chapter 9, Mishnah 2, maybe Mishnah 4, I forget. But it's in Mishnah Sanhedrin. And it's talking about how, when a king wants to mint coins, and this was 2,000 years ago, so they talked about kings a lot. They said when a king wants to mint coins, it makes a single mold for a coin, and then it strikes multiple coins, but every coin off that mint is identical to every other coin. However, when the Melech Malchei Hamlachim, when the King of Kings wants to mint coins, that king can start with a single mold, can start with Adam HaRishon, the first person, and strike as many coins off that mold as the king desires, and every single one will be different, and yet we are all created in the image of the Holy One. We got people sharing their 23andMe result. I will say we have people sharing their 23andMe results on here. I haven't done this yet. I'm a little bit wary of being in a database somewhere. I'm probably in enough of those as it is without swabbing my cheek. However, I am kind of curious because we've got kind of a mixed background in my family with some Native American, and I'm dying to know which part of the Native American world we're from. Somebody sharing we're 11% European Jewish on the DNA test. Another hero shares simple family tree math. I'm 1.5% Jewish, but it actually showed up in the 23andMe test. Kathy shares, even if we all had the same race, nationality, and religion, it would be the short people against the tall people or something similar. Reminds me a little bit of Gulliver's Travels, where they had people were pretty much identical except they cracked their egg on one side or the other and they decided to have a war about it. Miriam asks, how much Jewish DNA do you have to have, if it's accurate, before you're considered Jewish? And I'll say, for better or worse, but I think better, that's not actually how we measure it. Different groups of Jewish people have different ways of ascertaining Jewishness. The vast majority, or let me say this differently. I'll say the dominant trend in Jewish law and tradition, and this is observed by the Orthodox world as well as the conservative world as well, that you are Jewish if you were born to a Jewish mother or if you convert to the Jewish people with mikveh and Beit Din. That means a court of 3 rabbis and immersion in a pool of living waters. Right? That's the typical route for conversion. So if you were born to a Jewish mother or you convert or if you convert by the standards of the community that you are joining upon conversion, then you are a Jewish person. In the recent past, the Reform movement altered its stance, and this isn't a small fringe group. The Reform movement is probably the largest group of Jews in the United States today, just the United States. Other countries have different proportionalities, but this is a very large group of Jews who decided, okay, you are Jewish if either your mother is Jewish or your father is Jewish, as long as you have some sort of sense of Jewish identity, or if you convert to Judaism by the standards of that community. And so you're either born into it or you dip into it. I'll say either you're born into it or you convert. And different communities have different standards for, whether it's your mother or your father, whether it's just your mother or your father that determines your Jewishness. The question that I think is most pressing is, are you Jewish according to the standards of the community that you seek to belong to? I don't believe that people can self-declare as Jewish. And there are some people out there who will argue with me about this, like I should be able to define my own religious identity. And yes, you could worship whatever God you want to and follow whatever practice. But when you're a part of a family, you don't just get to declare yourself part of that family. It helps if the family gets to know you a little bit, and it helps if there's a ceremony, as Rabbi Greenwald shared on, I believe, episode 1 of the Jew Curious Show podcast. Family can be dispersed and diverse, and there are some family members you see all the time. There's some family members you never talk to. There's some you wish you guys weren't in the same family. I've been there. I have a family too. But no one person can just walk in off the street, walk through the front door without knocking, grab a beer out of the fridge, and put his feet up on the couch, right? You have to join the family. People have to get to know you, and that's what the conversion process is all about. And so we don't do it by 23andMe. First off, that is a very recent innovation scientifically, and Jewish tradition and law just doesn't change that quickly, even in places where it changes quite rapidly. I'll say not that rapidly. So there is no genetic measure of Jewishness, which once again leans toward the idea that this is not a biologically determined people. And I'll say there are people out there who disagree with me about this. I've got all sorts of videos on there. I've got all sorts of videos on YouTube about conversion, the conversion process. I told the story of my own conversion a couple of times. And I always get people of, let's say, varying degrees of informedness saying, haha, that's fake. You're either born Jewish or you're not Jewish. And sometimes these are Jewish people. Sometimes these are not Jewish people. Most of the time I can't tell. But there are Jews who think you can't convert to Judaism. And there are non-Jews who think that you can't convert to Judaism. And to both of those people, I would, open up a couple of books and say, well, according to Jewish law, you're wrong. According to Jewish history, you're wrong. And according to the received tradition of the vast majority of Jewish communities, that's incorrect. And so you can join the family, which again erases any possible notion that Jewishness is a racial identity. Does some Jews look alike? Yes, I'm not going to deny that. Is there some sense of peoplehood? Is there a sense of shared family and identity that feels like the ties of blood? Absolutely. But it is definitely not true that you can't join the Jewish people. I mean, we have standards. We have a process. You can't just pop in one day. But just the fact that you can join a group of people means that it's not a race. It's not purely and exclusively genetically determined. So I'm just going to say, I'm just going to look through the chat a little bit, just looking for some questions. People are asking about the distinction between patrilineal and matrilineal descent. If you look at the Bible, it seems like Jewishness is largely patrilineal in the sense that the father, the head of the household in a particular family, determined the Jewishness of that household. Tribal identity, tribes within the Jewish people, went by the patrilineal line. The one aspect of that that's preserved today is the distinction of some people know that they are Levites, and some people know that they are Kohanim, because that family tradition has been passed down from father to son, from father to daughter, etc. And so biblically, Jewishness largely passed through the father. There were times of turmoil, and I think this goes back about a couple of thousand years, maybe a little more, in which the rabbis decided we're going to start tracing Jewishness matrilineally, in part because of the sad fact that was true then and is, God forbid, in some cases true now, of sexual violence being used as tools of war. And there were women who were having children who couldn't be certain, who couldn't be certain who the father was, but you always know who the mother is. And so the rabbis at that time decided, okay, we're going to trace Jewishness through the matrilineal line instead. The question has been raised. Now that we do have paternity tests and things like that, might we consider changing that standard? And in Jewish tradition and law, standards and those kinds of things change very, very slowly. Might it happen? It might. Has it happened? One could argue in the case of the Reform movement that they decided you are Jewish if at least one parent is Jewish. Plus, there's an additional caveat. It's not just about your lineage. They say if your father or your mother is Jewish and you have been raised with a Jewish identity, you know you're Jewish and you want to stick with that, then you're considered Jewish. So it's even in that case, in what might seem a lenient case of including patrilineal and matrilineal Jews, even there's an additional step that, let's say, transcends blood. You have to have a Jewish identity that you want to hold on to, plus have one parent as a part of the tribe. And so is that, again, in play? This is a decision that the Reform movement made many decades ago, and things change very slowly throughout the Jewish world. Sorry for the pause. I'm just looking over some questions here. We get plenty of booing of Haman's, which I'm happy to see. Again, I don't want to give the guy too hard a time, but he did try to wipe us out, so he loses a little bit of benefit of the doubt in my mind. One of our heroes shares talking about this talking about this matrilineality and being raised with heritage. She shares, there's no generational limit on this. My mother's mother's mother was Jewish, so by Orthodox and conservative standards, I'm Jewish. By Reform standards, she says, I had to convert because I wasn't brought up Jewish. And many times I've actually been on a Beit Din in a circumstance like that, where we don't necessarily call it a conversion so much as a recertification. Right? You're getting notarized. I mean, in many times people come back to their Jewish heritage after a long time, and if you're going to be a part of the family after a few generations away, you should know our holidays. You should know the family customs. You should know a couple of people at the table, not just for our comfort, but for yours as well. So I think that kind of coming back is something that I see all the time, especially here in Southern California. We have a lot of people who have settled here in a generation or two ago from Mexico, from South America, from Central America, who were descended from Jewish people, but that Jewish identity was either forgotten or suppressed for a couple of generations. But they found out about it, and they want to come back to this family that identifies as Jewish, and so they go through a conversion process. But in that case, it's not so much as a welcome to the family as it is a welcome home. And I'll even go so far as to say, of so many people that I've worked with, that I've taught, that I've been on the Beit Din for, not just me, this is other rabbis' experience as well, that so many people, whether they have a scintilla of Jewish genes in them or not, describe the experience of conversion as the experience of coming home. In some ineffable way, that's what they feel like. And I'll say I thought it was just me. Like, I couldn't describe the experience. People were asking me what it was like, and I said it felt like I was coming home. And I thought that was kind of a unique way to think of it, and maybe I was the only one who felt that way until I started sitting on the Beit Din, and person after person after person, and none of them had talked to each other about this at a time, but they all were searching for a description of that feeling and came up with that same word, home, coming home. And so I think there's something to that. As my colleague, Rabbi Cohen says, there's that Patrilineal, there's that spark in some people, and sometimes that spark just needs to be dusted off, just needs to be polished a little bit, just needs to be revealed among other sparks, and it begins to shine. And that's why people feel so comfortable in the family once they're there. Ruthie asks, my best friend's mom was born and raised Jewish, but her mom didn't raise her Jewish. So the mom was raised Jewish, but the daughter was not. If she were to find her way to Judaism, would she have to convert, or is she simply Jewish because of her mom? And again, this sort of depends on the community that she wants to be a part of. And sometimes maybe a Reform community may say, let's have this conversion process just to help you have that education. Even if she was in a Reform or Orthodox circumstance, I would say take the class. You might not necessarily have to technically go to the mikveh because you're already Jewish by Jewish law, but it's good to take the class, familiarize yourself with that, and sort of get caught up on the Jewish education that she might have missed. I'm just looking a little bit through the chat here. Miriam asks, are the Christian Israelis living in Israel really Jewish? No, if they're identifying themselves as Christians. Now, you can be born Jewish and convert to Christianity, and by some measure, you're still considered Jewish. Like if you had a baby, if it was a woman who was born Jewish, converted to Christianity, then had a baby, that baby would be considered a Jewish baby because its mother was Jewish. That's a different kind of category of what's sort of called an apostate Jew, or somebody who's off the path, but they're still part of the family, even if they're not talking to the family. However, if they were never Jewish and they just moved to Israel and became Israeli citizens, Israeli citizenship doesn't confer Jewishness necessarily. Now, people who are Jewish have a right to become Israeli citizens. There's a process to that as well. But just living in Israel doesn't make somebody Jewish. Andrew shares, my mother did a 23andMe, and the results found that there was both Ashkenazi and Ethiopian Jewish heritage in the mix there. Of course, I'm not using this to make the case to the Beit Din, but I thought it was interesting. I think it's absolutely interesting. I think there is something to having genetic memory. There is something to being connected to a people. There's also something about owning the heritage and sort of the cultural transmission, not just the genetic transmission. I'll say Jewishness is a little bit nature, it's a little bit nurture. It's both of those things, and neither one exclusively. Let's see, we've got an Eliyahu in the mix saying, are you Reform? I don't know if he's talking to me. The answer is no. I don't identify with the Reform movement. I'm Jewish. That's just a generic thing. I'm Jewish. The synagogues that I go to are conservative synagogues. I'm ordained in the conservative movement, but I'm not a Reform Jew, if that's what you're asking. Some people assume that about me because I seem a little bit liberal and I'm not as stuffy as some conservative rabbis are. And there's some stuffy Reform rabbis and stuffy Orthodox rabbis and all sorts of stuffy rabbis. And I'm just a little bit more laid back, I guess. Teresa just joined us. Hey, Teresa from Cyprus, who says she's in Australia for the birth of her granddaughter, Mazel Tov. Teresa has been part of this community for as long as this has been a community. I don't know, about 6 or 8 months now. And just always glad to see you, Teresa. Teresa is our friend from Cyprus, who is currently in Australia for the birth of a granddaughter. So we'll give her a big Jew Curious high five and hug from around the world. Thank you for sharing the great news with us. All right, I really appreciate everybody. All right, gang, I really appreciate everybody for joining us for this discussion. I know it was a bit of a monologue there in the beginning. There is a record that I wanted to set straight that a lot of people are familiar with, but there are enough people who haven't gotten the message that the whole quote-unquote science of race is bogus, and even if it weren't, you couldn't put Jews necessarily neatly into that pigeonhole. We are a people, and we are a people with a certain faith, and most of all, I think we are, as Rabbi Greenwald says, a family. And so I hope that we can treat each other as a family, and I know we disagree. Families disagree sometimes, but if we're going to fight, let's always fight as family, knowing that at the end of the day, we have each other's backs. That's why I appreciate being a part of the Jewish family, and that's why I really appreciate having everybody in the live studio audience learn with me today. And most of all, thank you, Hero, for listening to the Jew Curious show. If you want to connect with other Jew Curious people just like you, I highly recommend joining the Jew Curious Community Center. All you have to do is go to jewcurious.show in your browser /JCC for Jew Curious Community Center, and you'll find out how to join this private Facebook group that is lovingly tended, carefully guarded, and troll-free for people to share their story, share their journey, share support with one another. And one more thing, I just want to say that this particular podcast, this episode, this whole conversation, and all of our conversations would not be possible without the Jew Curious School. If you're looking for a place to take your Jewish learning to the next level with a complete introduction to Judaism class, in-depth courses on various subjects, a weekly Parashat HaShavua discussion, and my favorite part, an incredible community forum where Jew-curious people just like you get together, hang out, ask questions, support one another, and just kibitz. We'll use a Yiddish word there. We kibitz and we schmooze and other Yiddish words. If you want to learn more about that, just go to jewcurious.school/info and see if it is right for you. Once again, Hero, thank you for listening to this podcast. And until next time, peace. All right, everybody, thank you for hanging out with me today. This is kind of a controversial subject that I have very strong feelings about, but I wanted to set the record straight for those few people left who think in a certain backwards way. I'll say, again, I don't like othering people, but when it comes to folks who would separate us to either take away our agency or to consolidate their own power, I'm also always happen to thumb my nose at that kind of stuff. So let's see. We'll be talking about some different stuff tomorrow. We'll be talking about the Parshat HaShavua on Thursday and something altogether different on Friday. We're here every day this week at 1 p.m. Pacific time. And one last thing, while there are people still there, 2 favors I want to ask. First off, give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed this discussion. Give us a thumbs up here. If you have questions that didn't get answered today, or if you have an idea for a future episode, please put that in the comments to this particular video. And finally, I was going to talk about this in the beginning, but I got on my soapbox right out of the gate. I want to tell you about something fun that we're doing that I haven't told everybody about, because I wanted to try it once before and see if it flopped before I advertised it. Last night, for the first time, we had the Jew Curious Late Show. Right, we had the Jew Curious Show, and there's, you've heard of like the Late Show on TV. We had the Jew Curious Late Show, and it wasn't here on YouTube. It was on this platform called Twitch TV. This is a whole other platform for live streaming videos. It's mostly used by people playing video games to watch other people play video games, or to play video games where other people can watch them. But it's a great live streaming platform, and it's also got a section where people just chat about topics, various and sundry. And I think I'm the first rabbi there. I may be the first rabbi on Twitch. And last night we had the Jew Curious Late Show, where it was a Q&A with a chat just like this. But what I did was, instead of having a topic, I just started teaching Mishnah. So if anybody out there wants to learn Mishnah with me, I'm going to go back on there tonight. It's Karen says it's in the wrong time zone for sure. However, those classes, or I would say classes, it's more of a show and kind of a hangout, but we learned some stuff. Those are all recorded. And so if you go to twitch.tv/Jew Curious, and I'll send around a link to this as well, you can see the recording of last night's session. We actually got through 3 Mishnayot of Masechet Brachot, chapter 1, and we'll be continuing from there tonight. So if you miss it because it's too late for you, I understand some folks have bedtimes and sleep hygiene, and I have neither of those things. I'm a terrible sleeper, a bit of a night owl / insomniac. And so I'll be up late tonight teaching some Mishnah, answering some live questions. And if you miss that, you can just log into Twitch TV the next day, look for Jew Curious, and see the recording of the previous night's session. So we're going to try that as well. So we have a 1 o'clock show. We have like our afternoon show. And then we have a late night show as well. I feel like Steve Harvey or somebody like that, or maybe Ellen, if Ellen had a late night show as well as her daytime show. I don't know. But in any case, love trying to teach Torah to as many people as I can, whatever tools are available to me to do that. And so I'm trying something else. I'm not leaving YouTube. I'm going to keep coming back every day. As long as we have something to learn together, I'll be here. But I'm trying to do a late night thing as well. So I'd love it if people could just come over and check that out, support me. Let's see. Budrad asks, possible future topic, where are Enoch and Elijah, Jewish concepts of dimensions heaven? So, well, I'm going to take a look into that. I mean, the short answer is they're in heaven with God, but what does that mean in a Jewish concept? And some of it gets into the mystical. So maybe that's what we'll talk about on Friday. Anybody else have ideas? Always looking for ideas for show that people are interested in. And so keep this up. Love it if you would join me on Twitch tonight. We'll start at 10:30 Pacific time, and all you have to do is go to twitch.tv/Jew Curious and find out all about that. So with that, I'm going to just give everybody a high five, boo, and say Yasher Koach, great learning with you today. And until next time, heroes, peace.